I was born with what is known as a blue baby, which is another way of saying that I was born with a hole in my heart. My open heart surgery took place in the Children's Hospital in St. Paul, Minnesota, when I was 5 years old and almost 6 years old. It seems like only yesterday when I think back on the event. I was only 5 years old when I experienced this, yet even then, I was aware that I was no longer in my body. As I took a glance around the operating room, I noticed the surgeons, nurses, and other pieces of equipment. As I ascended farther, I came face to face with an entity that was made entirely of light. It was just pure light. There were no arms or legs on it, and there was nothing covering it. Even though it was a very, very brilliant white light, looking at it did not make me uncomfortable in any way. Even though the being of light had engulfed me, I did not have a physical form. I was devoid of shape. It seemed as though I had become one with this light. I could make out sounds in the distance, but I couldn't make out what anyone was saying. It was like listening to people talking in a busy room, but the volume wasn't as high as it normally would be. I did not feel any fear. I did not feel even the slightest bit of fear, not even close to what a child of 5 years old may feel. My awareness of what was happening at the moment was limited to what I was consciously aware of. The entity remained with me until it was time for me to depart again. I was not given the option to either turn around or stay here. After pulling away from me and saying, "It is time to go back now," the entity disappeared. While I was engulfed in its radiance, I had the sensation of being very loved and that I was very cherished. I did not experience any pain, nor did I have any feelings of regret or despair. Love and calmness, nothing more. Following the blood transfusion, the next thing I remember is waking up in the recovery room with tubes still hanging out of my sides. However, I did not experience any fear. While my mother was sobbing, all I could do was hold her hand. It didn't bother me in the least. In fact, I felt great. When I was 16 years old, the doctors informed me that it was quite unlikely that I would ever be able to give birth to naturally occurring children. I have 3, and not a single one of them has ever given me any trouble. It appears that 2 of them have picked up some of this psychic ability by being among the others. Both depict many of the events that took place in my life when I was 5 years old. The younger one is now 12 years old, while the older one is 15. Regarding the third, I can't say for certain what is going on because she has not yet mentioned anything weird occurring to her. Every one of my offspring is a female. After the operation, I was able to predict when individuals were going to pass away. When I was younger, I once got in trouble for claiming that my great-uncle was going to pass away shortly. He died 2 weeks later. When I was 16 years old, I had to say goodbye to my closest friend, and 2 weeks before she passed away, I had a dream that foretold her passing. The only thing that I could make out was a white coffin with pink flowers painted on the borders of it. When my great-grandmother passed away, I was completely prepared for what my mother was going to say before she ever picked up the phone. I knew precisely what was going to be said. At the time, I was 11 years old. In January of 2000, my grandfather passed away. 3 days before he died, I was standing on my balcony when I noticed a change in the air. At that time, my grandfather was nearing the end of his life. It was during the winter. It was very much like witnessing steam from a hot concrete surface rise in the summertime. I had a feeling it was something horrible, but I didn't know what it was. Then, 3 days later, my mother gave me the news that my grandfather had passed away over the phone. At a young age, I discovered that I had a talent for writing. When I was in the 3rd grade, we were meant to be practicing our cursive writing, but I usually ended up writing something else and had to start over. This caused me to get in trouble with my teacher, and I had to start all over again. I had no choice but to do it. I didn't even know I was doing it until I believed I was through writing in cursive. At that point, I realized what I was doing. The majority of the time, it was shown to be a tale of some kind or another. I am completely unable to draw, but when I write creatively, I find it quite easy to create pictures with words. It has been said that I am particularly skilled in the art of poetry. I compose short tales, but they're often nothing that anybody else would find interesting to read. I get the impression that there are spirits in the rooms I enter. The atmosphere gets quite thick, and it almost seems as though they are attempting to communicate with me by speaking to me. However, I cannot hear what they are saying. Once, when I was frustrated with the overall concept of it, I shouted at the thing, "If you are here, then show yourself to me," and demanded that it appear before me. At that very instant, waves of movement could be felt in the air, as if something were attempting to pass through it from a different location. I instantly turned my head aside, and it immediately stopped. I don't always sleep when I should, since I'm always busy doing something else instead. Unfortuitously, whenever this occurs, I find myself in a situation in which a child or children are being harmed, most of the time, ahead in time. I am helpless in the face of unspeakable horrors because I cannot intervene. When I travel, I am able to take in all that I see, hear, and smell. When I was younger, I went through one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. A guy opened fire on his wife and their 3 children. I awoke in my bed, frozen with panic and unable to move. 2 days later, a guy around 40 miles away from where I reside opened fire and murdered himself as well as his whole family. When I have these kinds of experiences, I am usually not myself, yet at the same time I am. In the situation with the guy, his wife, and their children, I was there for the entire event, just as a mother would have been. I am aware that he fired first at her. I was able to make out the children's wailing, screams, and pleadings in the distance. When I am in a room with a lot of people, I am able to experience all of their happiness, as well as their sadness and their physical suffering. To put it mildly, it's a revolting experience to say the least. In the course of my life, I have experienced 2 further NDEs, after undergoing a tubal ligation procedure as well as a discogram. These are some of the things that happened to me during and after my NDE. No, I am unable to explain them. Do you want me to comprehend it? Yes. Next up is our NDE story from yesterday. I've been meaning to get around to doing this for a number of years now. Even though I had excellent intentions, having to go back and experience it again is not the easiest thing in the world. To be sure, it's a piece of cake to explain it. But when the words gaze back at you and you feel the emotion associated to them, well, to say the least, it's a bit overwhelming. How many times I booted up the computer, and I think I even have it partially saved on a disk somewhere, but I was never able to finish it. I would just stand there and allow myself to be transported back in time, feeling the floodgates open, and in the stillness of the written word, I would reestablish my connection with my own personal slice of heaven. In reality, it all started much before the main event. It was the summer of 1994, and I had been having some issues with my health for a time at that point. My first major financial setback came when I was laid off from my work, and that year was a struggle for me as I tried to get my life back on track after that. That event was a nightmare in and of itself, but I made sure to take the necessary precautions after going through it. There is no doubt that things are not better on the other side of the fence. The experience I gained from it helped me land a temporary position with the company that had previously employed me. I was able to build some valuable connections in the human resources department, and once the temporary position came to an end, it was only a matter of weeks before I found what seemed to be the ideal job for me at the time. I remember when I first started, I was definitely on the point of getting pneumonia, but I didn't have any health insurance and I didn't have a lot of money. I was simply too proud to ever consider requesting assistance. I was able to get better, but for the next year or 2, I had a persistent feeling that a cold was about to attack me. I had become something of a workaholic, which is not the best trait to have for a secretary since it leads to poor time management. However, I was in need of something to occupy my time. I had a large number of friends, and I was part of one of the popular groups at the club, so my buddies and I frequently went out and danced. Obviously, there was something that was lacking. I was clueless on the nature of the mystery item. I had done a lot of introspective meditation, but I never seemed to go anywhere with it. I assumed that it was because I wasn't doing anything correctly. After completing a course in holistic studies a few years earlier, I honestly believed that I must be one of the outcasts of the world since I was unable to locate the area of expertise that best suited me. Everyone else appeared to have gotten themselves involved in something and was making good headway. Not me. I kept reading and looking, but I couldn't find anything relevant. I muddled along. During an afternoon shift at work one summer, I found that I suddenly couldn't breathe and had the sensation that I was going to pass out. I was successful in contacting the other office. However, the nurse that I wished to speak with was unavailable when I called. After hanging up the phone, the sensation went away on its own. I put it off as an irrational experience, like a brief case of sick building syndrome, thinking that the lack of fresh air mixed with my sensitivity to toxins had caused me to become overcome. It was over the Labor Day weekend in 1994 that I first became suspicious that something was off. I was at the yearly block party that my family throws, and I was feeling short of breath. My entire life, I've suffered from asthma, therefore I was constantly using my inhaler, so I continued to huff away. As the day wore on and the temperature continued to rise, I found that I had less and less energy. I was able to put up a brave front. And as the evening wore on, I summoned the strength to admit defeat and go for the exit. At this point, I was having trouble breathing, and I made the decision that I would get in touch with my doctor as soon as I returned to work. I had been successful in the past, so I reasoned that I was probably just exhausted on top of having allergies to the beginning of fall and perhaps having a cold towards the end of summer. The weeks passed without any significant occurrences. The fact that I was perfectly well when I went to the doctor suggests that the incident was probably simply something that happens towards the end of summer. On the 20th of September, I had a day at work that was very typical. I went on a strenuous walk the previous evening, so I figured that must be why I was feeling a bit sleepy today. I was quite good at pointing the finger at someone or something else. I was getting ready to do what I always do on Tuesday nights when I saw how gloriously warm the evening had turned out to be. I would get my laundry together to bring to my sister's house, then pay a visit to my nieces and my infant nephew, and finally, I would meet the crew at the club for our line dance night. I had no chance of making it to my dancing gig. I went to my sister's house, where I did some chores and then played with her children. I even walked Maggie, their cocker spaniel, while I was there. During this time, I felt my chest beginning to tighten, so I reached for my reliable inhaler. It did help a little bit, but not very much, so I opted against going to the smoke-filled club. After I got home, I immediately started taking apart my laundry. While I was folding towels and linens, I noticed that I was beginning to tense up. After taking a tablet and using the inhaler a couple more times, I waited for it to take effect before continuing. As time went on, I began to experience a worsening of my symptoms. I was having issues, so I phoned the office of my primary care physician to let them know that I would be going to the emergency hospital for treatment. I wanted to see if he could call me back with the instructions. After that, I dialed my dad's number and asked him to have his friend drive me into the city. I started to feel worse and panicked as I waited for him to walk the few blocks while we were together. A few months earlier, my doctor had provided me with an EpiPen in the event that I ever found myself in a precarious situation. I felt like I was a lion trapped in a cage. After some consideration, I chose to have the injection. I felt myself becoming more anxious and began to pace more often. My father had come at this time, and I demanded that we wait outside until he got here. It was roughly 8:35 o'clock in the evening. I took a hold of his arm, and we started walking down the first flight of stairs together. When we approached the landing, I saw that my peripheral vision had begun to get impaired. Throughout it all, on the other hand, I was sputtering and babbling away. The remainder of the narrative concerning the actual events was relayed to me by my father. As we descended the second flight of stairs, I did not let go of his arm and continued to cling to him. He said that as soon as we reached the pavement, I began rambling and pulled him into the middle of the roadway. At this moment, I was totally immersed in darkness, and I assumed that I was functioning off of the energy that I had built up. It was alleged by him that I pulled him out onto the street and then placed my foot there. He was not able to yank me back to the secure ground of the pavement. I passed out in the middle of the roadway as he was catching me, and he suddenly felt my body go limp. He made an attempt to pull me away from the danger, but I was a dead weight. Because it was a pleasant evening, many of the neighbors were out on their patios enjoying the weather. When they saw what was happening, they immediately dialed the emergency number, screaming for assistance. Several of them came down to assist my dad in removing me out the path of the oncoming vehicle. I did not budge 1 inch. He kept my head off the roadway and stated I was rolling my eyes around and heaving air. He also kept my head off the street. At this time, my body had completely shut down, and the result was that my muscles were limp and heavy. I had expelled every last bit of the contents of my body. I was in some sort of problem. At this moment, there was already a significant number of people there. A fire truck was the first vehicle to arrive at the scene of the accident. On the sidewalk, the firefighter performed the intubation on me. After the arrival of the paramedics, they performed whatever blood tests they normally conduct to identify whether or not drugs were involved, and then they started life support. There were alerts sent to the hospital to let them know that our arrival was getting closer. Despite this, it took over 40 minutes to stabilize me to the point where I could be transported, and that's not counting the time it took to get me onto a stretcher and onto the vehicle. In the meantime, my doctor was quite worried that I had not yet arrived to the local hospital, so he had been phoning my house many times to check on me. Because of the precarious nature of my situation, the EMTs would transport me to the hospital that is geographically closest to my house. It is a Catholic hospital that is just a few miles away. That night, I had many encounters with angels, some of whom took the appearance of humans and stayed with me until I received medical assistance. Nobody saw them arrive, and nobody knows where they went after that. They were never able to see their actual faces. However, they managed to convince me to keep going. My adventure is about to start. I was pleasantly drifting through a pitch-black tube, with no particular direction because I had no body to gauge, when I observed that the darkness was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was brimming with love and joy and calm, and it simply brought me along in life. Waves simply crashed over me and led me forward in a gentle manner. I couldn't help but be overwhelmed by the love that was all around me and the knowledge that I could return the sentiment. At some point in time, an entity appeared before me and proceeded to show me throughout the cosmos. I was taught about the beginning of the universe and how galaxies came into being. I was able to go to locations that were so advanced that they were beyond my ability to comprehend. And I also got to see areas that are just getting started. Because of the overwhelming love and compassion that was shown to me, I was able to put aside my concern for the well-being of my human transporter. I was too preoccupied with meeting my creator and playing on a star to pay attention to the EMTs as they proceeded to work on me and get me ready for transfer. It never occurred to me to be concerned that there were no bodies, and the word terror was not even in my lexicon. The assimilation of things occurred instantaneously, and at that very same moment, all knowledge was entirely ingested. These entities could not be classified as either masculine or female. I have no clue how long this went on for because there is no means to measure time, and so I have no notion. Unimaginable things were demonstrated to me and explained to me. After each encounter with the entities, I would find myself back in the tunnel, floating around, only to come across other beings. At some time, I became aware of a single glimmering point of light. I drifted closer and closer to it. My way was abruptly obstructed by a massive entity that appeared to be gray in hue. I tried going over it, around it, and through it, but none of those options worked. I can recall doing my best but having no success. In the end, I requested that it allow me to pass. It responded with a polite refusal. I again inquired. It again said no. On the earth plane, I was becoming a bit testy, so I commanded it to move and tried to push it out of the way. No luck. The being, who I referred to as God, told me that in order to fulfill my duty, I needed to return home. Back on Earth, the medical professionals were working as quickly as they could on me. My vital signs were dangerously low, and it was unclear how much oxygen I had lost as well as whether or not there was any damage to my brain. My pupils were fixed, and they were unable to elicit any response from me. So the doctor went into the room where my parents and sister were to tell them that he didn't know how much longer I would hold on, and he would leave them alone to talk about funeral arrangements. He also told them that he didn't know how much longer I would hold on. Concurrently, I was reaching the end of this great adventure, and at the same time, my spirit was returning to my body. At this same time, I got up off the table and punched a nurse in the face with such force that the other staff members felt I had either broken her jaw or given her a concussion. I had been drinking. It's hard for me to fathom how strong I was back then. They honestly believed that I was trying to remove the tube from my neck, but in reality, it was my soul re-entering my body. I know this because it happened. My medical record indicates that this took place around 1:05 in the morning. I had no notion where I was, what day it was, or what time it was when I woke up. In fact, I had no concept of anything. My friends, coworkers, and even my boss were gathered around me when I was in the hospital, and my family was there as well. At the same moment that I came to, I was aware that the knowledge that had been put in me was being covered up. I was aware that it was present, but I was unable to access it. To put it mildly, members of my family were in fits of laughter. I made several attempts to contact them, but I was prevented from doing so because of my allegedly violent behavior. My sister filled me in on what had happened with me punching a nurse, and all I could do was giggle uncontrollably after hearing what had transpired. Also at this time, I was unaware of how little I actually was. I mistakenly believed that I took up the entire space. I felt certain that I was floating. We communicated using sign language, and I reassured them that I was all right once we did so. Not long after that, a nurse walked in and started asking me questions to see whether or not there was any harm to my brain. I quickly grabbed the pen and paper and wrote down the answers to her questions before she asked them, including my name, address, and social security number. I even wrote down my computer password at my place of employment. My manager saw that I was doing well and gently suggested to the nurse that she should give me space. I wasn't in any danger. She persisted in her inquiries, so I decided to create some nursery rhymes to entertain her. After that, she departed. The doctors were coming in and out of the room to check on me, and they couldn't believe I was still alive, let alone that I didn't have any brain damage. I was able to persuade my family that it was safe for them to depart and that I would be okay. The nurse who was hit by me came to meet me with an ice pack on her face. I was the one who hit her. In light of what I had done, she managed to keep a cheerful demeanor. She gave the impression that this conduct was typical of someone who had recently returned to their body. At this moment, I began to question what on earth had just taken place. In the evening, I received several visits from departed relatives who assured me everything was going to be all right. At the course of the subsequent several weeks, I was reminded that I was in this location for a purpose, but I was unable to recall what that purpose was.